Hey, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is Leif Babin. Leif Babin, he's a decorated former Navy SEAL. He's the co-author of the #1 New York Times best-selling book, Extreme Ownership. Now, I'm going to bog down here for a second, but this is, I think, one of the best leadership books of all time. I've read at least 50, maybe closer to 100 plus leadership books. I'm obsessed with leadership. So you might see this. I've got a video on the 7-Figure Principles podcast or in the YouTube channel about my top 5 best leadership books of all time. Extreme Ownership is one of those. Also, we've done this as a book club at Self-Publishing School internally at least twice. It's on the list of books to buy for every new employee. So we've purchased a lot of copies of Extreme Ownership, and anytime someone asks for a leadership book recommendation, that's the first book that I recommend, Extreme Ownership. I think it's, again, one of the best books of all time. So highly recommend getting it, buying it, reading it, whether you're a leader or CEO. It's a really great book. But Leif is also the co-founder of Echelon Front, where he serves as a leadership instructor, speaker, and executive coach. Today, we're going to be talking about how he launched one of the most successful books of all time, and really multiple books that have done really, really well in Extreme Ownership and the Dichotomy of Leadership. I've read both. Both are great. Also about using a book to grow a consulting business. They've done an amazing job of that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about working with a co-author. That's something we get questions about all the time. Like, how do you do that? And so I'm excited to dive in. Leif, really good to have you here.
Great to be on with you, Chandler. Thank you for the kind words about Extreme Ownership. Just happy to see that those lessons are being implemented and helping you and your team do better as well as other leaders in whatever industry they may be in.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And I'm not just saying it, it really, it's like, for me, it's on the yearly or maybe every other year reread list. It's just good to come back to.
Well, you might be surprised that it's on there for me as well. And you know, we do a lot of work. It's interesting how we'll kind of drift off. We'll say some things, talking about a topic, diving, deeply into that. And of course, the challenge is always, how do you, in the most simple, clear, concise terms, describe, the topic you're trying to discuss. And oftentimes I will go back to the book and realize that we did that, in a way, just through the editing process, in a way that we maybe drifted off of, and we need to get back to that particular verbiage. Most simple, clear, concise way to say that.
100%. It's funny how that works. I feel like, a book does that. And then sometimes, if you're working day to day in the trenches with companies, consulting, all that, it's just like, you can try to reinvent it, but then you realize, I already said this and I said this better than I'm saying this right now. So I can just point people back to this, and I myself can go back to that and kind of use that as a tool. So I'd love to dive in. Like, why did you guys decide to write this book, and how did that process go? And specifically starting with Extreme Ownership.
Well, Jocko and I, as you know, we both served together in what's now called the Battle of Ramadi in 2006. And it was just some really difficult and violent combat operations. And we got a chance to serve in operations that were, we say sustained combat operations, that day in, day out, almost every single day, going out on different combat missions. And those were incredibly humbling. We learned some tremendously humbling lessons learned, frankly, and we got a chance to come back from those combat operations and then teach the next generation of SEALs. Jocko took over training for the West Coast SEAL teams that was training and preparing SEAL platoons and task units to deploy forward to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I took over running what we call the junior officer training course, which was the training pipeline for every single SEAL officer that graduated from our basic training program, or BUDS we call it. So we were trying to pass on the lessons learned. And so we had to try to crunch those lessons down in just a finite amount of time, pass those lessons on. And then as I left active duty in 2011, Jocko had retired the previous year after 20 years, and I left at the 13-year mark. Then I had to try to figure out what I was going to do with my life, and I was going to go back to school. I was on the verge of going to law school. And frankly, I lost some friends in a helicopter that got shot down August 6, 2011. Extortion 17, and largest loss of life in a single incident in the history of the SEAL teams. And just a horrible, tragic incident that, again, reminded me of lessons that I already knew, which is life is really short. You got to do what you really love to do and what you want to do. And so I realized law school is probably not something I should pursue. But what I was passionate about was teaching leadership, was actually passing leadership lessons on. And I called Jocko. We talked about launching a company, and we did that. And as we worked with different companies, because he was already working with some companies, I had done some work with a few companies as well. And we just saw the need for leadership training. We realized everything that we learned in combat applied directly to any team, any organization, in any situation. And so as we started working with companies over the course of a few years, there was an increasing demand signal where people were asking us for a reference manual, write this stuff down. Is there something that we can have? And so we built a pretty extensive workbook that was a couple hundred pages long, that took forever to write. And I was writing it in Word and printing it out as a PDF. And finally we said, we need to actually turn this into a book. There was a lot of SEAL books out there at the time, some by respected operators who had served and done some great things, some by not so respected operators who kind of gave all of us a bad name. So that really kind of encouraged us that we actually want to get the message out, the real leadership lessons learned from actual SEALs who could speak about this in a humble manner and reflect well upon the SEAL teams and pass these lessons on to others. And so that's what really prompted us to write the book. So we sat down, we started, we started putting this together. We put together a table of contents and a little bit about who we were and just some guidance around the book with a sample chapter. And I handed it to a pretty high level literary agent that I happened to be friends with. And she said, I don't think so. You guys are about 2 or 3 years away, best case scenario, from writing this. It's not good enough. You should go work with an author. And we said, I kind of took that with a grain of salt. We always accept constructive criticism. That's what extreme ownership's about. So we knew we had to keep working. We knew we had to keep writing it. But we knew we wanted to write it ourselves as well. And then we handed it, we kept working it. We finally found a literary agent that we could work with who, and we shopped that proposal around to, I think the first 5 major publishers that we shopped it to said, no, thank you, sent us out the door. And we finally got in with St. Martin's Press and talked to their leadership. They were believers in it. They were excited about it, although I think the first print run was extremely small. I don't think they had any expectation that it was going to be successful. So, certainly not in the way that it is now. But it was a long haul in getting that done. It was probably a 2-year process, to being successful and getting the book published.
So 2-year process, and I want to go into that first print run, and then when did it start taking off and kind of all that stuff in just a second. But zoom in on the writing. So how long did you say you guys had the company before, and you had instruction manuals and stuff like that? But how long from then until you started working on the book, or really until you published it?
We launched our company. The first work we started doing with businesses was toward the end of 2011, and we officially launched as a company Echelon Front in early 2012. And then the book was Extreme Ownership was eventually published officially October 2015. So it gave us a few years of some business leadership experience and learning how lessons that we learned applied. And but it took a little while, I think, for us to really realize we frankly didn't want to be the SEALs that were out there writing books. That wasn't our intention.
Totally. Yeah.
It's not something that we thought about, but we realized there was a real need for leadership. And as soon as we walk into a company and see some big frictions, between teams that weren't actually working together, that weren't mutually supporting one another, we'd realize they need the concept of cover move. They need to understand this. Or, hey, people don't understand the mission. People aren't communicating in a manner that's simple, clear, concise, or they're not using decentralized command. They're waiting for a senior leader to make a decision, and everyone's just waiting there. And then, of course, the concept of extreme ownership was just needed everywhere because people are making excuses, casting blame, pointing fingers, and no one is actually solving problems to move the team forward so that they can be successful and execute. So I think that's really what drove us to publish it was seeing the need for this and that it was applicable. It's also what drove us to persevere through people turning us down as well, because we knew that this was needed.
Yeah. And all those concepts, I mean, even prioritize and execute, there's no bad leaders, only bad teams, no bad teams, only bad leaders. Like all those, I feel like just come up daily. It's just such good frameworks. You talked about it was important to write it yourself. Why was that important? I know a lot of people, you're growing this consulting company. A lot of people would say, I don't have time to do this. Let's bring in a ghostwriter. This is not my skill set. Like, why was it important to write it yourself? And kind of a two-parter here. Also, how did you land on the framework? Because I feel like at least a lot of military and SEALs books that I've read are way more memoir based. but I think the framework that you landed on was really solid, which is, okay, there's story, which illustrates the point, and then there's application to business. And I think not only did that probably make writing the book easier, but it also from a readership perspective, like, I find myself, it's way easier to read. And even the audiobook is unbelievable. And I love how you have the sound effects, the explosions, all that stuff. Like that's a cool touch. But then it's like you find yourself listening for the next story, and then that keeps your attention through the application, and then story, and then keeps your attention. And it just, like, I feel like it's woven together really well. So why was it important to write the book yourself? And then also, how did you land on that process, or kind of that framework for writing the book?
Well, first of all, I appreciate that you like the sound effects. We actually had to fight very hard for sound effects. Jocko was not initially a believer in that. I had to convince him that we needed to do that instead of us just making a, boom, boom, boom noise with our verbally, to actually put some real gunfire sounds, in there, machine guns or explosions. And the publisher fought against that. Macmillan Audio was like, I don't know about that. If someone's listening to this in their car, they're going to get freaked out. And we have had a few cases of that, but it's been minor. And I that was a good touch. I felt like that was the right call. We pushed for it. The question you're asking, I think, is a great one, Chandler. Frankly, I had seen several friends of mine who we had served with, that had basically sold their story to an author, and had sat down and told the story to an author and expected that story would get vetted, and really had less to do. Once they sold the story, they lost control of it. And so the way, if you ever talk to like Chris Kyle, for instance, who was American Sniper, Chris was our lead sniper, point man, and a close friend of mine, and someone who obviously we tragically lost, 2013. But he was, if he was here today, I think he'd tell you that he was a lot different in person than how the book kind of portrayed him, and how the movie portrayed him too, which so many people have read. Same thing for Marcus Luttrell as well. If Marcus Luttrell and Chris were both humbled by difficult and dangerous combat operations, and that doesn't come across necessarily with how the author wrote that. There's a lot of kind of chest beating bravado, which is not those guys. It's different from who they are, because I know both of them very well. Mark's a good friend of mine as well. So, and those books were fantastic. They were great books. They really gave some insight and credit to the SEAL teams. But I just seen that I'd seen that there's a difference once you give control of your story to someone else. We knew that the lessons that Jocko and I wanted to write, we didn't want to write a memoir. We wanted to write something that talked about leadership lessons learned and gave application of those leadership lessons learned so that people could take and implement them in their professional and personal lives. So we felt like we needed to write this thing. It was pretty daunting initially because, 3, I think, of those first 5 publishers we talked to said, we would never consider this unless you'll work with an author. Basically they looked at me and thought, well, I probably can't write my name, much less write a book, which I can't blame them. We look like knuckle draggers. I get it. But we knew that we just needed, what we really needed was an editor. We knew that we could tell the story. Jocko was an honors English major. You wouldn't tell that by looking at him, but he's a good writer. And I think it became very valuable for us to edit each other's work, make sure that it was clear. Everybody has a tendency to kind of overwrite, so be able to take that and just compress that down was important. And the other thing too is, like, you're talking about the format of the book. When we first started that, the initial chapter was in the third person, because we were trying to say, okay, how do we write about? I'm writing about Jocko doing something, but I'm describing him, but then if he's describing me, how do we do that? So we started with this kind of third person, description, and it just didn't work. And so we quickly determined that we needed to kind of, make sure that okay, we got a combat story, we're going to illustrate a principle, we're going to talk about application of business. But even in every chapter, that wasn't clear. Like chapter 12, the Dichotomy of Leadership, of Extreme Ownership, that wasn't quite the same. It wasn't super succinct. We initially didn't start out with kind of right in the action of a story for the combat story. So all those things we kind of, And frankly, how we got to that was we started writing and we gave the manuscript to people to seek their feedback. And I gave it to some very successful business leaders who I knew were kind of the target audience for this. My wife, Jenna, who was on television for 10 years and is excellent at taking a complex idea and making it very simple, gave some great feedback. But several close friends of mine in the business world, I was living in New York City at the time, gave us some really critical feedback, and including there was a writer at the Wall Street Journal who gave us some interesting insight of like, hey, I loved how you started this chapter. If you started every chapter kind of in the action like that, it would be useful. So just, that's one of the things I see people make a mistake when they start writing is they want to have a complete product and then they want to publish it and then get people's feedback on it. And the reality is it's going to take multiple iterations. I always tell people this: if you want to write, don't even worry about your initial draft. I mean, you're going to, we probably have, I don't even know, somewhere between probably 3,000 and 5,000 man hours tied up in extreme ownership. I mean, it's easy. Just that kind of iteration over 2 years of just writing and rewriting and editing and re-editing and re-editing. And it's hard to actually turn that off now, because when I read the book, I'm like, oh, we could have said this better, or that was redundant, or we should have taken this out. So it's hard to actually turn that off. But you're going to, when you start doing this stuff, just start putting thoughts to paper, and then you can take it and then you can organize it and then you can cut it down. And that's generally what's going to happen is you're going to write something way longer than it needs to be. And you're going to cut that down to be able to say it more succinctly. But obviously we've learned a lot, by the time we wrote Dichotomy of Leadership a few years later, we were a lot better at writing this. And so it was easier to edit each other's stuff. It still required a lot of time and effort. And that is one thing I think Jocko had initially considered maybe we should use a ghostwriter, because I don't know if we have enough time to put that in. I was vehemently against that. I fought hard against it. It was absolutely the right call. And I think Jocko certainly agreed. And he came around to realize, like, yes, we need to do this. But I will say it was a massive undertaking. And you can't underestimate that. There was no way that we could do what we're doing now with our consultancy, Echelon Front, our leadership business that we run. And probably, it was a full-time job writing extreme ownership for probably a good, 18 months.
Yeah, that's awesome. So many great lessons in there. I love keying in on your rough draft is clearing your throat. Editing is never done. It's about the iterations, the constant improvement, like all those things. I want to talk a little bit more about the writing piece, and then kind of transition into book marketing, launch, using the book to build your company, all those things. I want to talk for a second about the co-author process. I think it's one of the hardest things to do from a book writing perspective. And in my opinion, there's not much harder than writing a book with someone else. I always say it's kind of like having it's almost like trying to paint a painting and then having two hands on the paintbrush. Like it's really difficult. So can you walk through kind of like pros, cons? How did you navigate that process? How did you do it well? And maybe even more importantly, like the end product that doesn't feel jumpy. Like sometimes when you have, I feel like a co-authored book, especially if it's split in chapters, it can feel like you're jumping and there's no kind of cohesive narrative. So how'd you do that well? What were pros and cons, lessons learned?
There's no question that's a challenge. The good news is Jocko and I've worked together extremely closely since 2005. We've edited each other's everything from award citations to fitness reports and evaluations of our team. So we've worked on a lot of things together. And I always seek Jocko's guidance on things. He'd reach out to me to seek guidance on things. So, we already had that process in place. The biggest detriment to working with a co-author is the biggest detriment to leadership and working with a team, anything that you're trying to do in the world, and that's ego. If you let your ego get in the way, oh, I'm a better writer, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. I think what enabled me and Jocko to work together well on this was simply the fact that it was about the mission. It was about writing something that was clear. If he was going to get upset if I recommended an edit or made some changes to it, then then that would be a problem. Or if he made some changes to what I was writing, or if I get upset, like, oh, he thinks he's Bill Shakespeare, he's trying to look over my shoulder and fix these things, then you're not going to be able to get along. You're not going to be able to make that process work. the goal is when you have someone who's just wants to deliver a good product, wants to make it clear. And, again, I think you can't do enough of that. I really like the process of having someone who's going to go through that in detail and edit it, and we spent a lot of time on the phone together. We spent a lot of time with, just a Word document with the, you turn on the track changes on and you can see the changes that are being made, in real time on the manuscript. And there's a lot of challenges to go in that, because I was on the East Coast in New York City at the time, and Jocko was on the West Coast in San Diego at the time. So we got different time zones. We're trying to do this in different locations. We did get together at some points and go through a few things, but it also required, we had, hour and a half, 2.5 hour, 3.5. I think our longest phone call running through changes and edits for the manuscript was over 5 hours long. So, just that's what we had to do in order to put in the time and effort to make that work. But really, it's just about putting your ego in check and saying, okay, how do we deliver a good product? I think the track changes was important because, I'm not just making changes to Jocko. I might say, hey, it would be a little more clear if we said it this way, but I want to keep his voice in that. And the same thing, if he's editing, one of my chapters, it's, hey, you might want to say it this way, or this might be a little clearer here, or, hey, we should research that a little more. So it's always just good to have a second set of eyes, or, hey, you know what? This could be taken out of context here. If we're just describing one of the units we worked alongside, we want to make sure that, I think that happens a lot of times where people will read, it says maybe something they don't mean about somebody else, and people take offense to that. And that's where you fully realize that the pen is mightier than the sword, when you've got, someone reads something and is like, I can't believe you wrote that in there, or, that's an inaccurate description of what happened, or our unit. So it's really important to actually have multiple eyes on those things, reading it. But it's all about just putting your ego in check, seeking feedback from others, and realizing, okay, I want to keep my voice and keep my authentic voice. So, I'm not going to have Jocko write the chapter for me, but I want him to edit it. I want him to actually look over it. I want him to make sure that what I'm saying is clear, that the point and description is clear. And at the end, my goal is a well-written book that's easy to understand, that people can apply to their world, so that they can lead and win. And that was the goal for us. We shared that goal. And so, we weren't going to let our egos get in the way of impeding that.
For sure. That's great. So let's just shift gears a little bit to kind of the marketing business growth side of things. You said you did a small print run. A publisher probably didn't think it was going to do that well. Walk me through, like, how long did it take until the book really took off? And what were some of the things that you guys did from a marketing perspective to really help, from a launch perspective, from a marketing perspective, to really make that book go?
Well, the initial print run, so we had a very small advance for Extreme Ownership, which at the time we thought was like, oh, cool, we're getting an advance. It was absolutely minimal, compared to kind of what we know now. But the reality is, we had a publisher who believed in the mission. The president of St. Martin's Press, Sally Richardson, had come down for the meeting, and been there with our editor there, Mark Resnick, and their whole team, from St. Mark's Press was there. They were believers in this book, so gave us a chance, and we were stoked to be a part of it. I was there in person. Jocko had called in because he was traveling at the time. But from the beginning, they were believers in the book. What I realize now, though, is I think the initial print run was, I think less than maybe 5,000 copies initially. They bumped it up to 10,000 copies. So, which for them, that was extremely small. It wasn't going to be, when I look at the original paper that it's printed on, you can barely even see, like, the photos at each of the chapters. You can barely even see them. They're super grainy, just very poor quality paper. If you got one of those first editions out there of Extreme Ownership, it's kind of a rarity now. But we had some extraordinary support through Fox News. My wife worked at Fox at the time, and I had a great relationship with the chairman and CEO, Roger Ailes, who was a fantastic guy and a real believer in the book. And they gave us just an incredible rollout. I mean, we had a rollout for Extreme Ownership that was just completely unprecedented, I think, for even personalities at Fox News. Bill O'Reilly was not too happy for us being on his show at the time, I think, because we'd already been on Hannity's show. And so there's conflict there. You know, they don't want to, there's a guest on one show doesn't get to be on another show. And when the boss says do it, they got to do it. So, you know, we had an incredible role out there, and very quickly, I think as we had a meeting, St. Martin's Press realized they needed to bump that thing up to, you know, we started getting into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of copies, you know, as people were buying the book. I think what's been, you know, we had a lot of great support too from Don Imus for Imus in the Morning program as well. Was a huge believer in the book and promoted it all the time, even when I wasn't a guest on his program, which I was with some frequency. But I'd hear about him promoting it, you know, on his radio program, even without that. So, you know, just people who were good folks who believed in the book, who saw the need for the message, you know, to be spread across America and around the world, and that, you know, those relationships that we were able to build and have a friendship with folks who could really help in that regard.
And why do you think, why do you think they resonated with it so much and got behind it so heavily? I know you said Roger was a believer in the book, but like, why? And had he read an advanced copy? Like, how did you get the first set? Was it that the segments were going well? Like, why did they really get behind this so much? And then if you were to have like kind of a pie chart of those early months of sales, like, what part of the pie chart would you say was publicity versus some of the other things that you were doing from a launch perspective?
Yeah, I gave Mr. Ailes a copy of the manuscript before it was even published. I wanted to seek his opinion on it, and I gave several copies to a lot of people, you know, try to seek their opinion on it as well. I think, again, that's important. I mean, people don't want to do that as authors. You get a little scared of what people are going to say. Some people are not going to like what you publish. That's okay. Some people are going to have some feedback that you may not want to hear, or you know, sometimes you may have to. You've got to take the feedback with a grain of salt, because it's interesting. Some people would say, "Hey, decentralized command is kind of your weaker chapter. You may want to think about rewriting that." And then I have somebody else. I mean, someone I respected would say that. Then I give it to someone else who I also respect, and they'd say, "Decentralized command is the best chapter. You know, the whole book. I really love that. It really resonated with me." So you have to kind of discern, you know, what that feedback's going to be. You know, to your question about whether or not you know, marketing and publicity. The reality is, you can write an amazing book, that's an incredible book that impacts people, that people love, and if nobody knows about it, you're not going to sell any copies. So you've got to have the publicity, you know, and marketing there to get the message out there. There's no question about that. On the other hand, the reverse is also true. Whereas you can write just a garbage book, use a ghostwriter, don't really put any time and effort in there, don't really write from the heart. You know, I think if anything, what's made Extreme Ownership valuable, that book was hard to write. We're talking about mistakes that we made where you know, that where lives were lost on the battlefield. I mean, that very first chapter of Extreme Ownership, people, you know, Jocko didn't even want to write that chapter about the big blue on blue, this friendly fire incident that happened to us. And Jocko was like, "I don't know if we should put that in there. That's kind of hard to explain." And the reason is, it's hard to talk about. It's a big black eye for us. And the book would not be the same if we didn't open it up with this example of a horrible thing that happened to us, and how you know, Jocko stood up in front of the entire task and took ownership of that, and how we implemented lessons learned going forward to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again, and the impact that it had to our mission, and how many more lives we brought home safe as a result of that. So we had to do that. And I encouraged him to do that, and he bought off on it, and we made it happen. So, but that's so to my point, you can not put a lot of time and effort, not do a great book. You could be on television with Oprah and who's holding up your book, and get the most, you know, gigantic media rollout you could ever imagine, and you're not going to sell books if it's not a good book. You know, there might be an initial spike when people go check it out, but then that's going to go away. So what has driven Extreme Ownership, and what I'm so proud about, is we got an awesome media rollout initially in a way that was totally unprecedented, but that the sales have continued. And has continued to sell well because people buy 5 copies for their friends, you know, or buy 10 copies for their teams, or new employees that are joining the team, just like you mentioned, Chandler. And the book continues to sell because of that. And so I think you've got to do both. You can't have one without the other. And one thing I will say too, on the publicity side, is they've got a great team at St. Mark's Press and Macmillan that helped us out, publicity wise. However, I will say from a publicity standpoint, you have to look at like, I think often people are saying like, hey, we booked so many radio shows, or we booked so many TV shows, or we've got so many print publications writing an article. Those things are not at all equal, right? You might have a local broadcast with, a few thousand people watching it versus being on Fox and Friends in the morning with, 3.5 million people watching you. So those are very different things. They are not at all equal. And so I think what you have to do is try to build relationships, try to reach out, tie your story into a news hook that can actually get it out there. And then you also have to be good on television. You have to make sure that you're a good interview. And, that takes preparation, that takes rehearsal, that takes, understanding that be succinct in your answers, which is very hard. It's very hard to take and talk about a complex subject and cut that answer down to a 30-second, 45-second spot, for television. So that's something you have to practice. And the better you are on that, the more you're going to get asked back to be on other television shows to promote your book and get the message out.
That's great. And it sounds like you guys use publicity and targeted publicity to really early on get momentum with the book. And it sounds like the book started taking off relatively quickly. At what point did you start seeing this make an impact from a business perspective? And what did that impact look like? I know we always talk about kind of 3 buckets of like using a book to drive leads, sales, and referrals, but there's all these other things, right? Where it leads into the speaking side of your business. It leads into increasing average order values and being able to charge more and build out a team, like an instructor team and a speaking team. And I just see all the different ways that you guys have done this, and the business has grown from this book. At what point did you start seeing a meaningful uptick in business, and what does that look like?
Almost immediately, really. And our business was growing rapidly. We'd already been up and running for 3 years at that point when Extreme Ownership was published. I think what Extreme Ownership did for us is, beforehand, I would get a lot of people who would say, oh, okay, well, you learned some SEAL, you were a Navy SEAL, okay, had some combat experiences, and you have some leadership lessons learned. Well, tell me how you're going to translate that to my business. And a lot of people just had this misconception about the SEAL teams, whether they think everybody in the SEAL teams is this ultra disciplined Terminator robot that never questions the mission, does everything they're supposed to do all the time. Obviously, that's not true. I mean, SEALs are extraordinary people with talent, tremendous talents and capabilities. But look, every team you're on is a bell curve, right? You got some awesome people at the top that are kind of pushing the team, driving success. You got most folks in the middle that are pretty good, but need some oversight and direction. You got some people at the bottom that pretty much suck and shouldn't be there. Every SEAL platoon, every SEAL task unit is just like every team that's out there. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a professional sports team or a business team of any kind, any organization. That's what you got to deal with. So once the book was out there and people could read that and realize, hey, my team's not working together. I've got these 2 departments in the team and they're actually just in conflict with one another, or these 2 leaders are trying to sabotage each other. They need to understand this concept of cover and move. Or I've got a bunch of people making excuses. I need to bring in this concept of extreme ownership so that we can actually get these problems solved and move forward. That's what we need. So once they understood that, I don't have people saying, hey, how are you going to translate this to my business anymore? So, that definitely took off for our business. And even though we were already on some significant upward mobility, it enabled us to grow significantly more and just expand the business. And look, there's certainly value in, at least there was a few years ago, in being a New York Times bestselling author. I mean, that gives you a little bit more of a resume boost as far as speaker goes. I don't know how valuable that is today. To be honest, I think it's a lot more important to be a #1 Amazon author than it is #1 New York Times bestseller. That's kind of where my current feeling these days.
Cool. And I agree. So what have you guys seen? Like, what percentage I know this is like, it's probably hard to put your finger on, but like, what percentage of your growth today would you say over the last few years is because of the book? And like, what are some X's and O's, like ways that you've seen that kind of play out? And really, I kind of want to get into a little bit, like, how does someone go from reading the book and then ultimately doing business with you guys? Because I feel like you did a good job of that, where some books can just be very heavy and like, work with us. Oh, by the way, did you know we do that? Like all that, but it was very much sprinkled throughout. So I think it was embedded in a healthy way. But can you walk through kind of some of those X's and O's implications from business perspective?
Well, one of the things that we don't do, Chandler, is we don't give sales pitches. I mean, I'm constantly getting solicited for business, just as I'm sure are you and everybody else, that listens to this. It's just a constant thing, whether it's via email, whether it's the solicitation phone calls or even text messages, these days, LinkedIn, whatever it may be, people are just constantly trying to solicit business, sell you, pitch you on something. And, the reality is, I mean, we mention our company Echelon Fund a few times in the book, but there's not a, hey, if you want to come work with us, hire us, come do this. I'm vehemently opposed to that, and frankly, I'm not trying to sell you anything. If you read the book and realize that we can bring some value to the table, then reach out to us, our company Echelon Fund, and we'll come work with you. That's how it is for us. So I think there's too much of that. There's too much over the top for that. We don't do a lot of that. I think you got to be real cautious about that. Obviously, you don't. It's not that you don't want to mention your business, but I think if the purpose of your book is to boost your business, I think you're gonna have a hard time writing a successful book. That's just my opinion. Our book was the mission of Extreme Ownership. The purpose of that book, just like the Dichotomy of Leadership and the books Jocko has written, is to impact leaders, help leaders lead better, be more effective, so that they can lead and win on whatever battlefield they happen to be on. Both personally or professionally, in business or life. So that's the goal. And I think obviously what we do at Echelon Front is help leaders understand how to apply that in their world. But the goal of that was not to let's write a book to boost our business. We wanted to write a good book. And I think if you write a good book, that's going to impact people, then that book's going to continue to sell, which will then promote your business. So I think it's pretty hard to do. Have we had the purpose in mind of just simply trying to promote our business? I think Extreme Ownership might have sold a few copies and then just kind of disappeared.
For sure, because it stands alone, which I'm sure since then kind of one of the, because you did write it with that in mind. Like I've seen this play out for self-publishing school, but for a lot of other people too, is like how valuable it is from a true onboarding perspective. Like I would imagine like that's almost part of an onboarding new customers or whatever process. Or if they read that, like it's laying the foundation so that then moving forward, it makes it so much easier to work together. And they know expectations, they know kind of overarching concepts and stuff like that. So it just makes it even more impactful as they implement that in their companies. We're kind of in the home stretch here. Can you talk to me about, did you guys always plan to do the Dichotomy of Leadership? Was that, kind of a popular chapter that people kept asking about that you said, hey, maybe we should do a whole book on that, or how'd that come about?
No, just with the success of Extreme Ownership, we had a lot of people say, hey, when's your next book coming out? When are you and Jocko going to write a follow-on book? And it was, Jocko had launched the Jocko podcast. We published Extreme Ownership in October. I think Jocko podcast launched in December of 2015. So just shortly after that. And, that's something that's been impactful for leaders. That's been a huge marketing piece for Extreme Ownership. As well, and we had a lot of folks that were asking us for that, but we always said we're going to write a book when we see the need to write a book to answer the mail for that. And I had we saw a lot of leaders struggling with this concept of a dichotomy, that they had to find balance between these two opposing forces. And I had a very close friend of mine who's a highly successful business leader in the financial world, and he said, you know what? He's like, the hardest part of this is chapter 12, Dichotomy of Leadership, chapter 12 of Extreme Ownership. So you guys should consider writing that book. You should consider writing about the Dichotomy of Leadership and just expanding on that concept. And initially I was like, I appreciate the insight. I love this guy. He's a great, he's a great mentor and friend. And he's helped guide me in a lot of great decisions, including organization of the book, Extreme Ownership, and making sure that we kind of broke that up into the, combat example, business principle, and then business application. So I trusted his opinion, but I wasn't quite sure about that. And then life kind of just supported his hypothesis there. or his recommendation, because as we were working with leaders, I would see people who were totally bought in with extreme ownership. We got to be default aggressive. We got to make things happen. And they're getting too aggressive, and they're stepping on people's toes, and they're not doing their proper research, and they're getting far out ahead of their team. And it's actually causing problems, or they're trying to cover and move so much for somebody else on the team that they're creating frictional relationships because that person's offended that they're stepping in to try to do their job, or they're taking so much ownership of everything that their team's just standing around and waiting to be told what to do because, hey, well, the boss owns everything. Okay, solve the problems. Check, boss, tell me what you want to do, instead of people actually taking ownership at every level of the team. So we realized that we've actually got to write this book. We got to expand on this concept of that dichotomy of leadership, so that people understand that even though the title is extreme ownership, rarely are the extremes what's required for leadership. You need to find the balance between these two opposing forces. And ironically, we put a black and white on the cover of Dichotomy of Leadership. The reason we did that is because leadership isn't black and white. There's a lot of gray, and you got to find the difference between these two opposing forces and find the medium. And oftentimes you realize you toggle too far in one direction, and then you overcorrect, and then you let's say you're too, when you got to detach. Leaders get too far down on the details, so that they have a hard time seeing the bigger strategic picture. You're not advancing the strategic mission. You're having a hard time prioritizing and executing, so you got to detach. So now they realize they got to detach, and then that leader pulls too far out of the details. The team's got it. Now the team's going in different directions. They don't have the support they need. Maybe they're getting off on a tangent and kind of losing focus on what they should really be tracking on. So it's finding that balance between, being detached but not too detached. And just one small example of that. So we knew we had to write that book, and that's why Dichotomy was the follow-on that we wrote together.
That's great. Do you have plans for the next book? Is the next book in the works, or is it not for a while?
Look, I think when we see the need, we're looking for what the need is. Jocko wrote Leadership Strategy and Tactics that came out earlier this year, I think, which is a great complement to both Extreme Ownership and Dichotomy of Leadership about the tactical things that you can do as a leader at whatever level, senior leader down to the frontline trooper just in charge of themselves and their piece of the mission, to apply these things at a very tactical level. What are some actual steps that you can take? So I think that's a great book that kind of balances that and complements those other books. We'll write the book, the next book, when we see the need to write that book. We're always looking for that. We're working with leaders all the time and seeing what they need. But the goal is to write a useful book so that we can actually help people and impact their lives. I will say this, Chandler, one thing we didn't do a good enough job of, and Dichotomy of Leadership has been a highly successful book. It was a #2 New York Times bestseller. We've sold tons of copies of that thing. It's beat out some really high profile leaders that have written books, and continues to sell well in that regard. But it pales in comparison to the success of Extreme Ownership. And one of the things that always catches me off guard is, for every person that comes up to me and says, man, I really love Dichotomy of Leadership. It really helped me understand these concepts, and I found it to be even more valuable than Extreme Ownership, which I hear that a lot from people when they tell me about Dichotomy. But probably for every one person that tells me about Dichotomy, there's probably 4 or 5 people that come up to me and say, hey, when are you and Jocko going to write a follow-on book to Extreme Ownership? So they don't even know.
Oh,
they don't even know it's out there.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing. And it really, from an Extreme Ownership perspective, we haven't done a good enough job of talking about it, of posting about it, of getting the message out there that there's another book that complements Extreme Ownership that can be very helpful to leaders in any situation, to help them find the balance between these opposing forces so that they can be most effective. And so that's something that, I think it's easy to take that for granted when a book is successful as Extreme Ownership is published and continues to be successful.
Everyone's paying attention. They'll know when the next book's coming out.
So
all that.
Oftentimes we get so focused on our own world, like, oh, well, people are following me and they saw my post, or they're listening to Jocko podcast, or they heard him mention that, and that may not necessarily be the case. I mean, we're just at the 2.5 million copies sold of Extreme Ownership right now. And as of this podcast here, we're rapidly approaching that number. And yet, it's a tiny fraction of people who actually know of Dichotomy of Leadership. So we got to do a better job of getting the word out there. And I think that's another example of what I was talking about before. You can write a great book, but if people don't know about it, you've got to have that marketing strategy. You've got to have that the publicity for it. And there's a lot more we could have done, I think, to do a better job of pushing Dichotomy of Leadership that we need to continue to do going forward.
Man, those are great takeaways. And it's just so applicable to any creative endeavor. My brother's a Grammy nominated musician, and it's just like the same thing for their follow-on albums, right? It's like you just assume, oh, well, the fans know that this album's coming, it's going to get released on Spotify and everywhere else, and then they'll get notifications and whatever. But if you don't really push that, then you're getting drop off from one big book to the next, from one album to the next. Things like that.
There's no question about that, Chandler. And this is what extreme ownership means. Like, if you don't do it, nobody's going to do it. It's the biggest thing that we talk about. We talk about extreme ownership. It's all up to you. If you're going to lean on a publicity team, if you're going to lean on somebody else to do it for you, and they've got the plan in mind. It's great to have help, and that's awesome, and lean on people with expertise. But you got to take it on yourself to actually promote that effort. You're putting in all the time and effort to write a book or write a song, whatever it may be. Get out there, take ownership of that effort to publicize it, market it, and let everybody know. And you can't do enough of that.
100%. That's a great place. That's a very fitting place to wrap up the conversation. And I'll ask a kind of final question here. Knowing what you know now, 2 books in, and so you already touched on this a little bit. You said, hey, here are the mistakes we made from a Dichotomy of Leadership perspective and what you do differently. But knowing what you know now, if there's, to the other Leifs that are out there, pre-book number 1, they're thinking about going through and about to write and publish their first book. And what would be your advice to those folks?
My advice is, if you've got a story that needs to be told, if you've got a story that can impact people, for good, then be confident in that story. Be confident in the story. And even if you've got people telling you that not to, don't worry, or you're not good enough to write this thing, or you're not a good enough writer, you got to work with somebody else, or this isn't the time for this book. If you believe in what you're doing, then you got to drive forth with confidence to make that happen. Conversely, you also have to be open to criticism. You have to be willing to accept the edits and the impact, from people. Get the message to folks. Get out draft copies of manuscripts at the earliest stage. Take people's feedback and take it on board, and be willing to take notes and make changes and make things more clear. I think the biggest difference that I would do, the biggest difference between me today versus me pre extreme ownership, is I wouldn't try to write so carefully thinking that, like, oh, I've got to put this chapter down and that's going to be it. Because the reality is, as I said before, you're gonna have 1,000 different versions of that you go through and you edited that by the time you publish it. So you got to be willing to put in that work and effort, seek feedback from people, but don't get so caught up on the, like, I've got to get it perfect the first time, because it won't be, and that's totally okay. It's no factor. Just be willing and open to criticisms, and be willing to actually take the hard look in the mirror at yourself, so that you can constantly improve and make changes to get something that's a useful product that impacts your readers.
So great. And the dichotomy of book publishing, be confident enough to write it and open enough to get feedback. Really great kind of final takeaway there. Leif, this has been great, man. Really, really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people go to get your books, to find more out, to find out more about kind of what you're up to, Echelon Front, all that good stuff?
Yeah, you can buy our books anywhere books are sold. Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or any bookstore for Extreme Ownership, Dichotomy of Leadership, or any of Jocko's books that he's published. If you want to see what we got going on, echelonfront.com is our company, and we actually have a virtual training platform now called EF Online that you can get to efonline.com. That we're really excited about. We've got people from 33 different countries around the world on that thing right now. Just dive into the principles of extreme ownership in some detail. We do live Zoom calls with leaders on that. Multiple calls each week. There's some foundational course on there. There's some great kind of short videos that can get your mind primed to lead. We're super excited about that program. So come check us out at echelonfront.com or efonline.com.
That's awesome. Amazing. Leif, thanks again. Hey guys, buy the book, read the book. I don't very often heavily as probably this interview recommend a book, but it's literally top 10 books of all time for me, top 5 leadership books of all time for me. It's changed my life as a leader, and I have you to thank for that. So thank you for your service, and thank you for writing just an amazing book that's impacted not only my life, but just the lives of leaders everywhere.
Thank you, Chandler. Appreciate that.
Appreciate
It
it.
means a lot. That's awesome feedback.